Now, when it comes to sending requests from inside React apps, we must not forget that in the end, we're still writing regular JavaScript code, right? A React application in the end is just a JavaScript application. That is what it's all about. And since that is the case, we can of course use any send HTTP requests in JavaScript solution which we want. For example, there is a package called Axios which you could use. You can visit it on GitHub, which makes sending HTTP requests and dealing with responses very, very simple, no matter which JavaScript library you might be using. You can even use it without any library. But nowadays, we also have a built-in mechanism for sending HTTP requests from inside JavaScript, and that's the fetch API. The fetch API is built into browsers, and it allows us to fetch data and actually also to send data, even though the name doesn't imply it. And we can use that to send HTTP requests and work with responses. And therefore, it's the fetch API which I want to use here to get my movies. Now, we can start simple and make sure that whenever this button here is clicked, we do fetch movies and then we display the movies. And for that, I will simply remove my dummy movies here and instead add a new function here, which I'll name fetch movies or fetch movie handler. Fetch movies handler is probably a better name, like this. And in here, we can now use fetch, this function, because that's a function the browser makes available to us. That's this fetch API being used. And in its simplest form, we just need to pass in as a string the URL to which you want to send a request. So in my case, swappy.dev/API/films. To be precise, HTTPS and then that URL. We could provide a second argument here, which allows us to pass in a JavaScript object where we configure various options, for example, where we add extra headers or an extra body or change the HTTP request method. But here we don't need that because the default method will be get. So by default, a get request will be sent. And that's all we need here for the moment. So that will now send such a HTTP request whenever this function is called. But of course, we also want to handle the response. And fetch returns a promise, which allows us to then react to the response or any potential errors we might be getting. Now we're getting a promise here, which is an object which will eventually yield some data instead of immediately doing that, because of course, sending a HTTP request is an asynchronous task. It doesn't finish immediately. It can take a couple of seconds or milliseconds. It can even fail, of course. And therefore, we can't just continue in the next line of code and use the result immediately. Instead, the result will be there at some point in the future. And that's exactly what promises exist for in JavaScript. So we can add then here to define a function which will be called whenever we got a response. And we could add catch to handle any potential errors. But for the moment, let's ignore that and let's focus on the then case. Here we get a response, and then here I'll write an arrow function. We get a response, and then in this function body, we can use the response. And this response argument here is now actually an object with a bunch of data about the response. For example, we can read the response headers, we can get the status code. There also is a utility OK field, which will be true if everything worked, and false if we got some error. But here we're now interested in the response body. And this API sends back data in JSON format. JSON is simply a data format, a very popular one for exchanging data. And it looks like this. It looks like a JavaScript object, but keys are wrapped between double quotes, for example. And there are a couple of other rules you have to keep in mind as well. Also, there are no methods, it's just data. And the advantage of JSON data is that it's very easy to translate it to JavaScript objects, but there is a translation step which needs to be transformed. Thankfully, the response object which we get has a built-in method which will automatically translate this JSON response body to a real JavaScript object which we can use in our code. All we got to do for that is call JSON, which is a built-in method on that response object. And this will now do this transformation. Now this itself then again returns a promise. And therefore what we should do here is return that promise and then add another then block here, which will then be fired once this data transformation is done. And here we therefore then get our transformed data, which in the case of this URL will have this structure here. So it's an object with a count field, a next field, previous, and a results field, which then in turn holds an array. And it's this array I'm interested in here. So we can access data.results to get access to this array, like this, and then store these results in some state, which we then update in this place here, and which we then use here for movies list. So let's add use state and initialize an extra piece of state here in this app component. Let's say initially it's an empty array, and we name it movies and set movies. That's our state updating function. And here, once we got our movies, once we got the parsed and extracted movies, I will call set movies and set my data results. So this array here as my new state, as my new movies state. And now we just gotta forward movies here as a value for the movies prop. Now, one thing to note here is that in my application here, I'm actually extracting title, release date, and opening text from the data I receive. Now, there will be a title key, but opening text is actually called opening_crawl here, and release date is called release_date here. So we either adjust the prop names here, which I expect, or we make sure that we transform the incoming data from this format here to the format we expect in our app. And I'll do the latter. So in app.js, where we are making that HTTP request, before setting the data, the results as a new state, I'll actually transform them. So here I'll have my transformed movies, let's say. And that in the end will be data.results, which is this array we're getting back, .map to convert every object in the results array into a new object. And it's then the new objects, the array full of new objects, which will be stored in transformed movies. Now the logic for mapping here simply is that I get my movie data, or whatever you want to call it, which will have this format here, so like this object here, and I'm only interested in the ID, the title, the opening crawl, and the release date. So I will return a new object here, and this will be my movie object in the front-end application, which has an ID, which I get by accessing movie data.episode_ID. Because there is this episode ID field in the data we get back. And I now translate this into just an ID field in the data I'm working with here in my front end. Now for the title, we access movie data.title like this. And for my opening text, which I expect to get, I simply access movie data.opening_crawl. So the text stored in this opening crawl field will be stored in an opening text field here in the object I'm creating here. And then we also need the release date, of course, and that will be movie data.release_date. Now this is transformed, and now it's the transformed movies which I'll store here with set movies. Now to make sure that everything works, we now have to connect fetch movies handler, this function, to this button. And therefore, of course, here we add on click and point at fetch movies handler. If we now saved it all, we can go back to the React application And initially we got no movies because I removed the dummy data. But if I click fetch movies, you see it takes a short while, but then this movie data shows up. And this is now fetched from this Star Wars API and therefore from a backend app, which in turn is talking to a database. And that in a nutshell is how you do connect to a database from inside React apps. And since this is the wrong term, it would be better to say that this is how you send HTTP requests from inside React apps to a backend.